brief. There was a moment in the early 2000s where I was speaking with a very top-level leader in the International Churches of Christ. And this is just as Kit McKean's new movement is beginning to get underway. And this top leader says to me and others who are around him, well, when you look at the church in Corinth, and Paul sends the letter, 1 Corinthians to the church in Corinth, he doesn't start a new church in Corinth. He tries to address the issues that are in Corinth. And my first thought was, then why did you start the International Churches of Christ? How would you answer someone from the Churches of Christ in the mid-'80s or the mid-'90s who would use that very same argument to you? But that was quite blind to this leader. That was his way of describing what Kip is doing to him, and he had no ability to see that that's exactly what he had done to others. And so what I would say to maybe anybody who's in the International Churches of Christ at this point, who is very quick to criticize the international Christian churches, Kip's movement, just remember that that is how the Church of Christ felt 10 or 20 years ago.
Right.
That's what it felt like. So have some sympathy there.
Right. And if you didn't know, this is based in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
The leader lives right here.
Yeah.
So you're very close to it.
All right, here's what we're going to do now. We're shifting into some areas in which communication and dialogue has begun to reappear within the ICOC and the COC. And this is just really a sampling of things. You may have your own examples, and if you want to share those in our Q&A time, then you're welcome to do so. We've already mentioned some of the dialogues in the ACU lectureship or the Pepperdine lectureship. Doug had his own conference in 2006 entitled Who is My Brother?, to which he invited both members of the Church of Christ and members of the independent Christian churches and had them speak. And it was, I think, a very positive sign. One of the first times in at least recent history of the ICOC where that kind of communication led from an ICOC side had occurred, and that was very important. There are various publications, one or two of which I brought with me here. Foster Standback, who was in various parts of the ICOC and eventually in Los Angeles at various points as well, came and did a master's degree at Pepperdine in the early 2000s, finished I think in 2003. As his thesis for his master's degree, wrote a history of the International Churches of Christ up until that point, and eventually published it through the publishing arm, what became the publishing arm of the ICOC, the IPI, Illumination Publications International, run by Tony Mulholland. And so that is still accessible. You can still purchase this book, and you can learn a great deal about the history of the ICOC up until at least 2003, when his narrative is cut short. In 2010, John Wilson, who's here present among us, was able to use the periodical of Pepperdine University, Levin Journal, as a venue to help explain what had happened in the International Churches of Christ up until that point, and actually invited several members of the International Churches of Christ to contribute articles. And so the various names here that you'll recognize: John Wilson, Tom Jones, Gordon Ferguson, Steve Staten, Roger Lamb, Steve Brown, Jeannie Shaw, and Wyndham Shaw all contributed articles to this 2010, and you can get access to that online now as well. And I already mentioned the positive reviews of the two conferences in 2012 and 2016 in the Church of Christ Christian Chronicle as well. So in other words, dialogue has begun to reform.
And in fact, in 2003, with the collapse, with this total implosion of the ICOC, a very common reaction, probably the most common reaction that I experienced from brothers and sisters of the Church of Christ was not, "I told you so, now you know," or no, it was, "You were doing so many things right. You just changed this or that." But it's like, don't stop, don't give up your passion. And sometimes they said, "Don't become like us," which is an incredibly humble thing to say. And a number of figures in the Church of Christ were very helpful this time. I mean, I think John Wilson of Pepperdine in London, helping our brothers and sisters over there, and also in Mexico City, where's he been, with his wife Claudette. I mean, this was a fantastic thing. It wasn't just, well, we'll pray for you, but investing time, building relationships, and most of you won't be aware of that. But, I wish you were. Well, certainly it's progress when there is some training. At the very least, we need biblical training. structure. Jesus gave several years to his apostles, and that's why Peter was able to so masterfully handle the Old Testament on the day of Pentecost. So whether you have to go to seminary or not, that's a different discussion. But I think it's been quite positive. How many leaders from various parts of the ICOC, even before we started getting involved in restoration movement schools. So Chicago leaders with Harding, LA or Pepperdine is kind of convenient, and also now with Rochester, some of you. ACU, which is convenient if you live in Texas, although if you live 1,000 miles away from it and you're still in Texas, it may not be convenient. The state used to be its own republic. And then Lipscomb University, which is in Nashville, the ones who host the annual Christian Scholars Conference, and Lincoln Christian University, where right now, I've been doing adjunct work there for a while, thanks to Glenn Giles, an elder in Denver who is from the Christian church background, and also Steve Kennard of New York City. A number of undergrads also attend universities in the Church of Christ.
And Pepperdine, among others, has a fairly large contingent, between 20 and 30 or so, students who are from the local LA ICOC who are undergraduate students at Pepperdine. And Pepperdine has begun to try to open their arms to these students, I think, and nurture them. And that's another way of fostering communication. We wanted to note that we are actually aware of a handful of churches that have merged together. This is not the rule, this is part of the exception, but it exists. I have personal experience in one. When I lived in Hamburg, Germany in 2007, I went initially to work with the ICOC there, but this was a time, as you know, of severe identity crisis, particularly in the international ICOC churches, where they lost a great deal of United States support. And so this was a church that in many ways was...
Financial support.
Yeah, financial support, especially. This was a church that was reeling in some ways, had only recently been planted, and began to communicate with their local Church of Christ, the Gemeinde Christi in Hamburg, Germany, and had communications. And because I was on my way to LA Christian University the following year, I became something of a de facto liaison between the two churches. I had, at that point, studied enough to know some of what the ICOC had come from and some of what the Church of Christ was. And over the course of that year that I lived there, they joined together as a single church, and still are a single church. They have no paid minister. They rotate through who preaches. Various people have moved into Hamburg from both the Church of Christ family of churches and the ICOC family of churches, and have joined in with this church. And it's a church that still continues today. I visited them just a couple of years ago. And so that's, I think, an example of great success. The Munich church in the ICOC and the COC did something very similar much more recently in 2014, where they began to have conversations and then realized they could benefit each other. And I'll say this, there's something, when we're talking about specifically just the ICOC and the Church of Christ, there's a mutual benefit here. The ICOC brings a spiritual fervor that in many cases is lacking in the Church of Christ, a dynamism that is lacking in the Church of Christ. The Church of Christ brings a spiritual maturity and wisdom that in many cases is lacking in the ICOC. Together they complement each other very well, and they can learn and grow from each other very well. There's something to be said here. And maybe the most interesting example of all of these that is very oddly full circle here is in 2018, and then officially on January 1st of 2019, the Gainesville International Church of Christ and the Gainesville Church of Christ merged into a single church and now meets in the building that initially housed the Crossroads Church of Christ. They've renamed themselves, so they each have their own name. One was, I think, the Gainesville Christian Church, the other was the Campus Church of Christ, I think. And they've renamed themselves as the Campus View Church, and they are one body. And how did that happen? It happened very much in the same way that what's happening now in Los Angeles, that I'll explain to you in a moment. The ministers began having lunch, or breakfast, I think, once a week together. Or just members started having breakfast once a week together. And as they did that, they built a relationship, and they realized we are far more the same than we are different. And there are resources that we can share here that can be of value to each of us. And it took a great deal of time, but they built a relationship that allowed for this to happen. Now again, let me say, we're not saying this needs to happen in every situation. We're not saying it's necessarily a goal. But what we are saying is the gospel is being preached when churches come together again in the name of Jesus.
Amen.
And there is glory to God to be expressed when people can let go of what makes them different and join on to what makes them the same. Now, I'll explain one more thing that's happening here in Los Angeles. Many of you are familiar with this already, and some of you were part of the instigators of this even before I've become part of it. There's something that's very neat called Common Grounds that is happening in the Los Angeles area. And what this is not just Church of Christ and ICOC, but Church of Christ, ICOC, and Independent Christian Church people from all of these branches coming together quarterly for breakfast. And the motto is, unity starts with a cup of coffee.
So you must be a big coffee drinker, right?
I drink hot chocolate. So for me, unity starts with a cup of coffee.
That claim is groundless.
The principles, you had that one already, didn't you?
No.
And what is beginning to happen here is resources are being shared, right? So this begins as a chapter kind of in the Simi Valley area. And churches in this area, ICOC and Church of Christ, realize we are next door to each other, and we've never communicated with each other. We're next door to each other, and we can begin working together and sharing resources and facilities and so forth with each other. And now there's a second chapter in another part of Los Angeles, and the idea is that anyone can start a chapter anywhere that they want, where they simply want to begin communicating with the other branches of the restoration movement that are near them. And so we encourage that very much.
Excellent.
Move on to practicals and then give you time for questions.
Apologies may have been given, but probably some are still waiting to be heard or need to be given. If we've got the humility, we won't gloss over these things.
And we should mention that goes for both sides, right? That the damage has been done on both sides. And I know from personal experience from having talked to people, there are people who still feel that apologies need to occur. So that needs to be said. The damage is not done. The damage may yet be ongoing.
Second.
Yeah. We very much value, you know who's standing in front of you, we very much value continuing education. I teach New Testament, and I will say this, that my initial motivation for seeking a biblical degree, particularly at a Church of Christ university when I was in the Boston Church of Christ, the Boston ICOC, was so that I could give back to my fellowship, so that I could help prevent some of the mess that we had found ourselves into and fallen into that I think could have been avoided because we were so poorly educated. And so what I would highly encourage, and this goes to Church of Christ ministers as well, is that ministers make it their default that it is part of the expectation of the National Church of Christ to have a degree in Bible at some school. I think this will only benefit the ICOC. As far as I can provide it at Pepperdine, I very much desire to help support that idea. In fact, we are in the religion division of Pepperdine currently working on a remote master's program to help facilitate that idea, to go from city to city and make it more easily available for those ICOC churches that are not near a Church of Christ University or any other Christian university, to make education more accessible to them. So we highly value that.
Just as with the Christian churches with Lincoln, we have students all over the world. And a lot of my students that get their MA, they're from the ICOC. Others are Christian Church or Church of Christ or sometimes some of the other denominations. But that continuing education is that's a big deal. As I mentioned before, sharing conference speakers. If I'm going to a conference, I always ask organizers, who are you bringing in who's from like outside your tribe? You know, someone will have fresh eyes and offer something. And I'm very encouraged when that happens. If often it happens, well, no, not only we're not doing that, but we would never do that. My confuse our people. And fourthly,
get to know your neighbors. If you read Ephesians chapter 2 and into chapter 3, And you see how Paul describes what is probably the area that is most divisive of the first century church, the area of how Jews will get along with Gentiles, and what to do, whether Gentiles need to become Jews in order to be part of the family of God. And you see Paul's answer to this, where Paul describes what it is that Jesus has done. That Jesus has broken down this wall of hostility, that Jesus has taken these two and made them into one humanity. I think that is easily applicable to every area in which the church is divided. And one of those areas is within our Stone-Campbell Restoration movement. And so when you sit down with a fellow believer from another branch of the movement, you are living out the gospel. Paul calls this the mystery of the gospel. And the mystery of the gospel for him is the mystery that God always intended to bring the Gentiles into the family of God and make one new humanity out of Jews and Gentiles together. And so unity is part of the gospel. The gospel is being preached when you sit down with a fellow believer. Not because you're baptizing them, not because you're pulling them out of their tribe and into your tribe, but because Jesus is there present with you. And it is the mystery of Christ right there as you become one in the way that Jesus and the Father are one. And so our perspective is, this is the gospel. This is precisely what Jesus calls it.
Clearly, we're not saying that nominal Christians we should accept as brothers and sisters, people who don't have a spiritual bone in their body. But we're talking about unity among Christians, Christ followers. They're not just individuals.
Yeah. All right, that comes to an end. We promised that we'd give you time for questions. We have almost 20 minutes. What do we got? 20 minutes. We have 20 minutes of time for questions. I will try to repeat the question so that it is heard by all and also recorded onto our audio. And so let's simply